The winter of 1876 came early to the northern plains, bringing with it a cold that cut through buffalo hide and human flesh alike. Chief Lakota of the Lakota stood at the edge of his camp, watching smoke rise from cooking fires that burned lower each day. His people were starving. The buffalo herds had vanished, driven away by the endless columns of white settlers pushing westward. The promised food from the government agency had not arrived in 3 months. Children cried themselves to sleep with empty bellies, and the elders grew weaker with each passing sunrise. Lakota was not a chief by birth but by the respect he had earned through wisdom and courage. At 42 winters, his face carried the marks of countless battles and harder decisions. His wife, Winona, had died 2 summers ago from the white man's spotted sickness. His son, Chaitin, now 17, was among the young warriors who spoke increasingly of war. They wanted to raid the settler towns, to take what their people needed to survive. Lakota understood their anger. He felt it burning in his own chest like hot coals. But he had seen war. He had watched villages burn and listened to the screams of women and children caught in the crossfire. He knew that any attack on the settlers would bring the bluecoat soldiers in numbers his people could not resist. The defeat of Custer at the Greasy Grass had brought temporary victory, but it had also painted a target on every Lakota camp. The army was hunting them with a vengeance that would not stop until every lodge was destroyed. On this particular morning, a scout came running into camp, his breath forming white clouds in the frozen air. He brought news that made Lakota's blood run cold. A wagon train had broken down 15 miles to the east. 5 families, maybe 20 people total, stranded in the open prairie with a winter storm approaching. They had no shelter adequate for the blizzard that was building on the horizon. Without help, they would all freeze to death before morning. Chaitin heard the news and gathered the young warriors immediately. Their eyes gleamed with opportunity. Here was their chance to take revenge, to claim supplies, weapons, and horses. The warriors painted their faces and sharpened their weapons. They sang war songs that had not been heard in camp since the battle at the Greasy Grass. The whole camp could feel the electricity of impending violence in the air. Lakota called a council. The tribal elders gathered in the largest lodge, sitting in a circle around a small fire. Outside, the wind had begun to howl, and the first snowflakes were falling. The storm would hit with full force by nightfall. Chaitin stood before the council, his young face fierce and determined. He argued passionately for the raid. He spoke of their dying children, their empty food stores, their people's suffering. He reminded them of the broken treaties, the stolen land, the slaughtered buffalo. His words found agreement in many hearts. Then Lakota stood. The lodge fell silent. He did not speak of mercy or forgiveness. He did not appeal to the kindness of his people's hearts. Instead, he spoke of strategy and survival. He reminded them that the army was looking for any excuse to wipe them out completely. He told them that killing these settlers would bring certain destruction upon their entire tribe. He painted a picture of their camp surrounded by soldiers, their lodges burning, their families scattered into the winter cold with nowhere to run. But even as he spoke these practical words, something else was at work in Lakota's heart. He thought of his own wife, dead from disease brought by the settlers. He thought of the land his people had lost, the way of life that was disappearing like smoke on the wind. He had every reason to hate these stranded families. Yet when he closed his eyes, he saw not enemies but human beings facing death in the cold, just as his own people faced starvation. The choice before him would define not just his leadership but his soul. The council debate stretched into the afternoon as the storm clouds gathered darker overhead. Inside the lodge, the air grew thick with tension and the smell of pipe tobacco. Each elder spoke in turn, their voices carrying the weight of generations. Some sided with Chaitin and the young warriors, arguing that mercy was a luxury their starving people could not afford. Others supported Lakota, though their reasons varied. Some feared military retaliation. Others simply felt that killing helpless people, even their enemies, would stain their honor beyond redemption. Lakota listened to every voice, watching the shadows dance on the lodge walls as the fire flickered. He knew that whatever decision emerged from this council would echo through the lives of everyone in the camp. Choose war, and they might gain a few weeks of supplies before the army came to annihilate them. Choose mercy, and they would remain hungry, but their souls and their future would remain their own. Old Mapi, the eldest member of the council, finally rose to speak. He was nearly 80 winters old, his face a map of wrinkles, his hands gnarled like ancient tree roots. He had survived the great smallpox epidemic, the wars with the Crow, and the first encounters with white soldiers. His words carried an authority that even Chaitin could not challenge. He spoke slowly, each word measured and deliberate. I have lived long enough to see our world die twice over. Mapi said, his voice thin but steady. I watched the buffalo disappear. I watched the iron horse cut across our hunting grounds. I buried 3 wives and 7 children. I know what it is to hate. He paused, letting his words sink in. But I also know this, we are Lakota. We are the people who once ruled these plains not through cruelty but through strength and honor. If we become murderers of helpless people, if we kill families huddled against the cold, we lose the very thing that makes us Lakota. We become no different than those who have wronged us. Chaitan stepped forward, his jaw tight with frustration. Grandfather, with respect, honor does not fill empty bellies. Honor does not keep children warm at night. Our people are dying. How can we speak of honor when we cannot even feed our own families? The question hung in the air like smoke. It was the question every person in the camp was asking. Lakota saw his own struggle reflected in his son's eyes. The young man was not wrong. Their situation was desperate. But Lakota had learned something in his 4 decades of life. Desperation could make you do things that solved one problem while creating others far worse. My son, Lakota said quietly, you speak truth. But there is something you have not yet learned because you have not lived long enough to see it. Every action we take today creates the world we will live in tomorrow. If we choose to become killers of the helpless, that is who we will be. Not just today, but for all our remaining days. And when the story of our people is told by our grandchildren, they will have to carry that shame. Chaitan's face flushed with anger and something else, perhaps the first glimpse of understanding. So we should just let our own children starve while we save our enemies? What kind of father does that make you? What kind of leader? The words struck Lakota like physical blows, but he did not flinch. He had asked himself these same questions through many sleepless nights. The kind who understands that some choices destroy you no matter which path you take. The kind who knows that the easy answer is not always the right one. Outside, the wind had grown to a roar. Snow was falling heavily now, thick flakes that would soon bury the prairie in white. Time was running out, both for the council's decision and for the stranded settlers. If the Lakota were going to act, it had to be now, before the storm made travel impossible. The council took a vote. It was not unanimous. Several warriors sided with Chaitan, their faces dark with anger and disappointment. But the majority, swayed by Mapi's words and Lakota's leadership, chose a different path. They would not attack the wagon train. But what Lakota proposed next shocked even those who had supported him. They would not simply leave the settlers to their fate. They would save them. The lodge erupted in argument. Warriors shouted that this was madness, that helping their enemies was betrayal of the worst kind. Even some of Lakota's supporters thought he had gone too far. To refrain from killing was one thing. To actively save the lives of those who represented everything that was destroying their world, that was something else entirely. Chaitan stared at his father as if seeing a stranger, his expression a mixture of disbelief and betrayal. Lakota did not wait for universal agreement. He knew that if he hesitated, the moment would be lost and the settlers would die. He walked out of the council lodge and began gathering supplies. He took blankets from his own lodge, the thick buffalo robes that were meant to keep his family warm through the winter. He gathered what little dried meat remained from their stores. He saddled his strongest horse, a paint mare that had carried him through many battles. A dozen warriors stepped forward to join him. They were not the young firebrands who had been ready to raid the wagon train. These were older men, veterans who had fought in many wars and understood that true courage sometimes meant choosing the harder path. Among them was Takala, Lakota's closest friend since childhood, a man who had saved his life twice in battle and who would follow him into the spirit world itself if asked. Chaitan stood at the edge of the camp, watching his father prepare to leave. The young man's face was a storm of conflicting emotions. Finally, he grabbed his own horse and weapons. Lakota looked at him questioningly. I do not agree with you, father, Chaitan said, his voice tight. I think this is a mistake that will cost our people dearly. But you are still my father, and I will not let you ride into this storm alone. It was not forgiveness or understanding, but it was loyalty, and Lakota accepted it with a nod. The group of 15 riders left camp as the full fury of the blizzard descended upon the plains. The wind screamed like wounded animals, driving snow horizontally across the open ground. Visibility dropped to mere feet. The cold was so intense that exposed skin would freeze in minutes. The horses struggled through drifts that grew deeper with each passing moment. More than once, Lakota questioned his own sanity. They were risking their lives to save people who represented the destruction of everything they loved. They rode in silence, each man wrapped in his own thoughts and his own buffalo robe. The journey that should have taken 2 hours stretched to 4, then 5. The horses were exhausted, their breath coming in great clouds of steam. Ice formed on the warriors' eyebrows and in their hair. Takoda's hands were so cold he could barely feel the reins. He navigated by instinct and memory, knowing that even a small error in direction could send them hopelessly off course into the white void. When they finally spotted the wagon train, it was almost buried in snow. The 5 wagons had been circled in a desperate attempt at shelter, but the canvas coverings were shredded by the wind. Takoda could see shapes huddled beneath the wagons, people who had given up trying to fight the storm and were simply waiting for death. No smoke rose from any fire. They had run out of fuel, or the wind had made fire impossible. Either way, they were freezing. As the Lakota warriors approached, someone in the wagon train spotted them. Takoda heard a scream, thin and nearly lost in the wind. He saw a man stumble to his feet, raising a rifle with hands that shook from cold and fear. Other settlers emerged from beneath the wagons, some armed, all terrified. They knew who was approaching. They knew what Indians did to stranded wagon trains. The stories were told and retold throughout the settlements, growing more terrible with each telling. Takoda raised his hand in a sign of peace, but in the blizzard, gestures were almost invisible. He could see the settlers' faces, pale with cold and fear. There were indeed about 20 people, men, women, and children. Several children were very young, bundled in inadequate blankets, their lips blue from the cold. An older woman had collapsed in the snow and was not moving. These people would not survive another hour. One of the settler men fired his rifle. The shot went wild, disappearing into the storm, but the intent was clear. These people thought the Lakota had come to kill them. They were preparing to die fighting. Takoda saw one woman clutching 2 small children, her eyes wide with terror. He saw an older man trying to reload a rifle with fingers too frozen to work properly. He saw the absolute certainty of death in all their faces. And in that moment, Takoda understood the full weight of what he was doing. These people hated him. They feared him. If their positions were reversed, he doubted any of them would lift a finger to save a Lakota camp. They were part of the great wave of humanity that was drowning his people, destroying their way of life, taking everything his ancestors had fought to preserve. He had every justification to turn around and ride away, to let the storm do what their own poor planning and the harsh land had made inevitable. Takoda dismounted slowly, his movements deliberate and non-threatening. He handed his reins to Takala and walked forward through the snow, his hands raised and empty. Behind him, the Lakota warriors sat motionless on their horses, making no move toward their weapons. The settler with the rifle kept it pointed at Takoda's chest, his finger on the trigger. The man was perhaps 30 years old, with a scraggly beard and eyes wild with fear and cold. "We come to help," Takoda said in English. He had learned the language from missionaries years ago, though he rarely used it. The words felt strange in his mouth, but they were clear enough. "Storm kill you. We bring blankets, fire, shelter." The settler did not lower his rifle. "Why?" he demanded, his voice cracking. "Why would you help us? We know what you people do." The accusation hung between them, heavy with all the violence and betrayal that had poisoned relations between their peoples. Takoda could have listed his grievances. He could have spoken of broken treaties, of murdered chiefs who came in peace, of villages destroyed and buffalo slaughtered for sport. He could have made this man understand the depth of suffering the settlers had brought. But he did not. Instead, he simply said, "Because you die if we don't. Children die. That is enough." For a long moment, the settler stared at him, trying to understand. The rifle wavered, lowered slightly. The man looked back at his family, a woman and 3 children huddled beneath a wagon, shaking uncontrollably from the cold. He looked at the other families, at the old woman lying motionless in the snow. Slowly, the rifle dropped completely. The Lakota warriors moved into action with practiced efficiency. They built a fire using dried buffalo dung they had brought, coaxing flames to life despite the screaming wind. They created a windbreak using the wagons and buffalo robes, forming a pocket of relative shelter. They wrapped the freezing settlers in warm furs, paying special attention to the children and the elderly. The old woman who had collapsed was carried close to the fire. She was barely breathing, her skin gray, but she was alive. Chaitan worked alongside his father, though his face remained hard and unreadable. He wrapped a small girl in a buffalo robe, and the child looked up at him with huge eyes, too cold and frightened even to cry. Something flickered across Chaitan's face, not softness exactly, but perhaps a crack in his anger, a moment where he saw not an enemy but simply a suffering child. The settlers were too cold and shocked to speak much at first. They accepted the help with a mixture of gratitude and lingering fear, watching the Lakota warriors warily even as those same warriors saved their lives. Dakota distributed the dried meat his people could not afford to spare. He watched settler children eat food that should have gone to Lakota children. The irony was not lost on him, and the pain of it was sharp. As the fire grew and the shelter took shape, the immediate threat of death receded. Color began to return to frozen faces. The old woman's breathing steadied. Children stopped shaking. One of the settler women began to cry, deep sobs of relief and perhaps shame. Her husband put his arm around her, looking at Dakota with an expression that might have been the beginning of understanding. Night fell, though in the blizzard it was hard to tell day from night. The storm continued to rage, but now both groups huddled together in the shelter the Lakota had created. They shared the warmth of the fire and the dried meat. A settler man offered whiskey from his supplies, and Takala accepted, passing the bottle around. These small acts of sharing began to break down the wall of fear and hatred, though it remained far from gone. One of the settler children, a boy of perhaps 6, approached Dakota shyly. He held out a small carved wooden horse, offering it as a gift. The toy was crude but made with love. Dakota accepted it with a nod of thanks, feeling something break inside his chest. This child had no idea of the great conflicts and terrible history between their peoples. He knew only that a stranger had saved his life and that gratitude required a gift. Through the long night, as the storm howled outside their shelter, Dakota sat awake, keeping the fire fed. He thought about the decision he had made and its consequences. His people were still starving. These settlers would survive now, and they would continue west, would take more land, would bring more of their kind. Nothing fundamental had changed. He had not solved the great problem of his people's survival. He had simply chosen not to add more death to a world already drowning in it. Chaitan sat down beside him, staring into the flames. For a long time, neither spoke. Finally, the young man said, "I still think you are wrong, Father. We could have taken their supplies. Our children would eat." "Yes," Dakota agreed. "For a few days. And then? Then the soldiers would come." "Yes." Another long silence. Then Chaitan asked, "Do you think they will remember this? Do you think it will change anything?" Dakota looked at the sleeping settlers, wrapped in Lakota blankets, alive because of Lakota mercy. "I do not know," he said honestly. "Perhaps some will remember. Perhaps some will tell their children that Lakota warriors saved their lives when they could have left them to die. Perhaps it will plant a small seed that will grow into understanding. Or perhaps they will forget and continue to take and destroy. I cannot control that." "Then why?" Chaitan's voice was raw with genuine confusion. "Why give up everything for people who may never appreciate it, who may never change?" Dakota took a long time to answer his son's question, watching the firelight play across the faces of the sleeping settlers. Outside, the blizzard was finally beginning to weaken. The howling wind had dropped to a steady rush, and the snow was falling less heavily. Dawn was still hours away, but the worst of the storm had passed. Both the settlers and the Lakota would survive the night. "I will tell you something I learned from your grandfather," Dakota finally said. "He told me that we do not control what others do or what the future brings. We control only our own actions and who we choose to be. The settlers may forget this night. They may continue to take our land and destroy our way of life. But we will remember. We will know that when we had the power to choose cruelty, we chose mercy. That truth belongs to us, no matter what comes after." Chaitan absorbed this in silence. His face was no longer hard with anger but thoughtful, struggling with ideas that challenged everything he had believed. "And if our people starve because we gave away food to save these strangers? What then?" "Then we starve knowing we remained human," Dakota said quietly. "There are worse things than dying hungry, my son. Dying with a blackened soul is one of them." The night wore on. Dakota watched over the fire and the sleeping people, both Lakota and settler, who depended on its warmth. He thought about the world his son would inherit, a world growing smaller and more difficult with each passing season. The old ways were disappearing like snow in sunlight. The buffalo were gone. The open plains were being carved up by fences and settlements. The life he had known as a young man would not exist for his grandchildren. But while he could not preserve the old world, he could perhaps shape what replaced it. If even one of these settlers remembered this night, if even one told their children that a Lakota chief saved their lives when hatred would have been easier, then perhaps something better could grow from the ruins of what was being lost. It was a small hope, almost painfully small, but it was something. As dawn finally broke, the storm had passed. The world outside the shelter was transformed into a landscape of white silence, beautiful and deadly. The Lakota warriors began preparing to return to their camp. The settlers stirred, waking to find themselves alive and warm, wrapped in furs that smelled of smoke and sage. The settler man who had first pointed a rifle at Lakota approached him now, his hat in his hands. His name was William Harris, and he had been a farmer in Ohio before selling everything to try his luck in the Western Territories. His wife and 3 children stood behind him. "I don't know what to say," William stammered. "You saved our lives. All of our lives. We would have died without you." Lakota simply nodded. He began gathering the buffalo robes, preparing to take them back to his camp where they were desperately needed. William stopped him. "Wait. Please. You need those for your own people, don't you? That food you gave us, you need that too." Understanding was dawning on his face, slow and painful. "You saved us even though you're hungry yourselves. What we need is not your concern," Lakota said, but without harshness. It was simply a statement of fact. William looked at his family, then back at Lakota. "Wait here." He went to the wagons and began pulling out supplies. Flour, salted pork, beans, coffee. Not a huge amount, these were not wealthy people, but more than he could easily spare. Other settlers joined him, each adding what they could. One woman gave thick wool blankets. A man produced ammunition and offered it, then hesitated, realizing how strange it was to arm the people who had just saved them. Lakota accepted the supplies with dignity. It was not nearly enough to solve his people's hunger, but it was something. More importantly, it was acknowledgement, a recognition of debt and shared humanity. He loaded the supplies on the pack horses while his warriors prepared to depart. Before mounting his horse, Lakota turned to address all the settlers. They had gathered together, standing in the snow, these people who hours before had thought they would die. "You go west," he said in careful English. "More storms come. Winter not finished. Stay together. Watch for frozen rivers. 3 days' travel, you find fort. Soldiers there." One of the women stepped forward. Her name was Elizabeth, and she held a baby that had nearly frozen in the night. "How can we repay you? How can we thank you properly?" Lakota looked at her, at the baby in her arms, at all these people who represented both the destruction of his world and the simple human truth that life was precious. "Tell your children," he said finally. "Tell them Lakota saved you. Tell them we could have killed, but we chose help. Maybe they remember. Maybe things different for their children." The ride back to camp was quiet. The Lakota warriors were exhausted, cold, and burdened with the knowledge that they had given away resources their own families needed. They had gained some supplies in return, but not enough to erase the cost. Chayton rode beside his father, no longer angry but still struggling to understand. As they approached their camp, Lakota could see people emerging from lodges to greet them. He knew there would be questions and recriminations. Some would say he had chosen strangers over his own people. Others would fear the consequences when the army learned that Lakota had been near settler wagons. The divisions in his tribe would take time to heal. But as they rode into camp, old Marpy stood waiting, leaning on his walking stick. He looked at the returning warriors, at the supplies they brought back, and at the expressions on their faces. He nodded slowly, a gesture of approval that meant more than words. He understood what Lakota had done and why. That night, as Lakota sat in his lodge distributing the supplies to families with the youngest children, Chayton came to him. The young man sat quietly for a moment, then said, "I heard the settlers talking before we left. The woman with the baby, Elizabeth, she said she would write a letter to her brother. He is someone important in the government. She said she would tell him what you did, that she would ask him to help get food to our people." Lakota nodded but did not allow himself hope. He had heard such promises before, and they rarely amounted to anything. The machinery of government and hatred was too large for one grateful woman to move. But still, it was something. "That is not why I did it," Lakota said. "Even if nothing comes from her words, even if the soldiers still come for us, even if our people still starve, I would make the same choice." "I know," Chayton said, and for the first time, there was understanding in his voice. "I am beginning to see that mercy is not weakness. It is the hardest kind of strength." The winter continued, as brutal as before. Food remained scarce, and more elders died before spring came. The promised food from the government agency finally arrived in late March, though whether Elizabeth's letter had any influence was impossible to know. The Lakota survived, though diminished and changed. Years later, long after Lakota had walked the spirit path, a historian would come to the reservation looking for stories of the old days. Chaitin, now an old man himself, would tell the story of that winter night, of his father's choice to save enemies at great cost. The historian would search the records and find a mention in a letter archived in Washington, a woman named Elizabeth Harris writing to her brother about Lakota warriors who saved her family in a blizzard. The story would be recorded and preserved, a small footnote in the larger tragedy of the Plains Wars. But for those who knew it, it represented something important, proof that even in the darkest times, when hatred would have been justified and mercy seemed like foolishness, some men chose a different path. They chose to remain human, to honor life even when life had been cruel to them. Lakota never knew if his choice mattered in the grand sweep of history. He never learned if it changed hearts or policies or prevented any suffering. He died believing, as he had told his son, that we control only our own actions and the truth of who we choose to be. He had chosen mercy when cruelty would have been easier, and that choice defined him more than any battle he had won or any hardship he had endured. The silent act of mercy in that winter storm became a story told around fires on the reservation for generations. It reminded people that their ancestors had been more than victims or warriors. They had been human beings who understood that preserving one's humanity sometimes required sacrificing everything else. In a world that tried to destroy them, they had refused to be destroyed on the inside, where it mattered most. And perhaps that was victory enough.